This is part 2 of chapter 7 of Isaiah. Part 1 ended with Isaiah telling King Ahaz of Judah that the advancing armies of Aram and Ephraim were led by mere men and would not prevail against Judah and Jerusalem, which was still under the Lord's hand of protection. Isaiah reminds Ahaz of his need to stand firm in his faith, or else he would not stand at all. Part 2 of chapter 7 continues with Isaiah telling King Ahaz to ask the Lord for a sign to confirm the prophetic deliverance of Judah and Jerusalem just spoken. We continue in verse 10. Again the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or the highest heights. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. On the surface, Ahaz sounds almost pious in this response. After all, in Deuteronomy, Moses clearly states that we are not to put the Lord to the test. But this is different. Here God is telling Ahaz to put him to the test. Word of advice, if the Lord ever tells you to test him, do it. So God is telling Ahaz to test him, to ask for a sign to prove the prophetic word against Rezin and Pekah that has just been spoken. This war against Judah and Jerusalem will fail. And God puts this in the broadest possible sense. He says, whether from the deepest depths or the highest heights. In other words, there's no boundaries. Ask for any sign you can think of. No sign will be too small. No sign will be too large. Ask for a sign. Test me in this. And by Ahaz's response, what we see is that he truly does not trust God. I think it's safe to say Ahaz does not believe what he's just been told. Because we know from Ahaz's that little biographic sketch from 2 Chronicles that he has forsaken his God, that he is burning incense at the high places, that he's worshiping at pagan altars, that he's actually taken one of his sons, probably his firstborn, and sacrificed this child to the god Molech, because that's what it means when it talks about causing a son to pass through the fire. So Ahaz does not believe that God can rescue him. Does not believe that God is about to deliver Judah and Jerusalem from the hands of King Rezin and King Pekah. Then Isaiah said, this is verse 13, then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? You can almost hear Isaiah looking at his king and at least thinking to himself, if not wanting to say, you fool. God has told you to ask for a sign, and yet you still reject God. Then verse 14, and this probably the most powerful verse in this entire chapter. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Immanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. This is that first Messianic prophecy pointing to the ultimate virgin birth of Christ. Now, there are some liberal interpreters who take issue with this. To me, the passage in Matthew that quotes this prophecy, when Matthew, I believe, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, cites this passage as confirmation of the virgin birth of Christ. But those who are trying to discount this as a Messianic prophecy, especially a Messianic prophecy pointing to the virgin birth of Christ, they try to point this to a possible local, well-known, to the king at least, local maiden who is about to be married and who will have a son and will name him Immanuel, which of course didn't happen. There's some thought that maybe this was pointing to the birth of Isaiah's second child. We get there in the next chapter or so. But his second child wouldn't have been born of a virgin, for obvious reasons. And they want to cite as proof this timeline that they see here, that from the time this child is born until the child reaches that so-called age of accountability, the destruction of Aram and Ephraim will take place. Look again at verses 15 and 16. 15, he will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. Eating curds and honey. I'll go into that in more detail a little bit later in the chapter. But when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, as I said, this is what we refer to often as the age of accountability, when a child reaches that point where they know right from wrong. And it was thought to be around age 12 to 13. This has led to the tradition of boys within the Jewish community having a bar mitzvah at age 13 when they've passed their 12th year, and girls having a bar mitzvah at age 12, seeing them as now being responsible to read and interpret the Torah and being seen as accountable for their actions. So, for before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, in other words, when he's about 12 years old, when he reaches this age of accountability, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. And they like to see that as happening in Ahaz and Isaiah's lifetimes. But is that what this passage is saying? Especially when you add in verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel. To me at least, Jesus of Nazareth is the only one who fits this entire prophecy. Certainly Aram and Ephraim were laid waste within 12 years of approximately 12 years of this prophecy by Assyria. But they were also laid waste well before the boy Jesus would have reached that age of accountability, some, 700 years later. And remember that prophecies often have two parts. A long-term prophecy, which is coupled with a short-term prophecy to give verisimilitude to the long-term prophecy. To show that the long prophecy is correct, the short prophecy will come to pass sooner. In this case, the long-term prophecy is the prophecy regarding the virgin birth of Christ. And the short-term prophecy is in verse 17. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. Now, King Ahaz, who doesn't believe God, doesn't trust God, is at this point in his mind, I believe, considering forming this alliance with Assyria and Tiglath-Pileser. He's putting his trust in Tiglath-Pileser to save him and his kingdom from the combined armies of Aram and Ephraim. Even though God has just promised Ahaz that Aram and Ephraim will be defeated and that Judah and Jerusalem will not fall to them. And I believe what God is saying here in this prophecy of verse 17 is that if you put yourself in the hands of Tiglath-Pileser, it isn't going to go well for Judah, Jerusalem, and Ahaz. And that's exactly what happens. Continuing on to verse 18, in that day the Lord will whistle for flies from the Nile Delta in Egypt and for bees from the land of Assyria. They will all come and settle in the steep ravines and the crevices in the rocks, on all the thorn bushes and at all the water holes. In that day the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, to shave your head in private parts and to cut off your beard also. The result of Ahaz's alliance with Assyria would result in Judah becoming a vassal state to Tiglath-Pileser and the subsequent kings of Assyria. It would include ruinous tribute payments to Assyria. It would involve a near total domination over Judah and Jerusalem by the Assyrians. By the time this is all brought to a conclusion, and that's not until well into King Hezekiah's reign, Assyria has carved off substantial portions of Judah and claimed it for its own. And this domination of Judah and Jerusalem by the Assyrians doesn't really come to an end until, like I said, into the reign of King Hezekiah. And that is when Sennacherib comes up against Judah. Hezekiah has decided to rebel against Sennacherib. He's called on the Egyptians for help. The Egyptians move up, Sennacherib moves down, destroys the Egyptians, turns around, marches on Jerusalem. And as he's camped outside the city with 185,000 troops, Hezekiah puts on sackcloth and goes into the temple area. And Isaiah comes to him and says, "Fear not, God is with you." And that night, an angel of the Lord comes into Sennacherib's camp and slays 185,000 troops. That was the ultimate deliverance then of Judah and Jerusalem after this pact Ahaz made. But they had lost substantial portions of the kingdom that they mostly would never recover. Verse 21, in that day a person will keep alive a young cow and 2 goats, and because of the abundance of milk they give, there will be curds to eat. All who remain in the land will eat curds and honey. Now, on the surface, that kind of sounds not so bad. There's going to be an abundance of milk. The cows and the goats are going to give an abundance of milk. The problem is the eating of curds and honey is not a sign of good times. It's not a sign of prosperity. Why would you have an abundance of milk from your young cows, from your goats, probably from your sheep? Think about it. Why would you have an abundance of milk? Because it's not being consumed by calves and kids. There's not enough livestock being born, so you have this abundance of milk with which to make curds to mix with honey. And this isn't curds like curds and whey. This is actually, the word that's used kind of implies a churning of milk. In other words, basically what they're talking about is a form of butter. Now, honey butter isn't a bad thing. And honey butter was used quite often to spread on bread, to spread on cakes, the date cakes and so forth. But it seems to indicate here that the only thing they're going to have to eat is honey butter. Now, it's nutritious, it's tasty, you could probably live on it, and you would probably get tired of it after about 2 days. So it's not going to be a pleasant time when this happens, when Assyria comes in and essentially takes over Judah as a vassal state. Then in verse 23, it says, "In that day, in every place where there were 1,000 vines worth 1,000 silver shekels," and trust me, those are expensive vines, "there will be only briars and thorns. Hunters will go there with bow and arrow, for the land will be covered with briars and thorns. As for the hills once cultivated by the hoe, you will no longer go there for fear of the briars and thorns. They will become places where cattle are turned loose and where sheep run." The land that was once productive, the vineyards that were once fruitful, will become nothing more than wilderness. The picture presented here in verse 24 is showing basically wild animals coming in and beginning to take over the land. It will be a place for hunters to hunt. It will become a place fit for only cattle and sheep to graze. And I think the implication here is these are untended sheep and cattle grazing in these once fertile lands and once fruitful vineyards. In all this, the Lord is promising King Ahaz that Assyria is going to become the instrument he is going to use to bring judgment on Judah and Jerusalem as the result of Ahaz's abandonment of God, his descent into idolatry, his worship of pagan gods, and his ultimate alliance with Tiglath-Pileser and Assyria. Any questions? Okay, the Lord's judgments continue in chapter 8 next week.